My name's Clarence Whetten. I'm one of the advanced master gardeners at Thanksgiving Point, and I was teaching a seed saving class at the State Master Gardener Conference, and afterwards one of the people in the class came up and asked me if I'd heard of this group, and I hadn't yet. So I looked you up on the web and dropped Caleb an email and asked me if he'd like me to demonstrate soil blocking, since you were talking about sustainable seed starting today. For just a little bit of background about me, I've been a gardener all of my life, but about the last 10 years I've been really serious about gardening, and read Elliot Coleman's book Four Season Harvest about 8 years ago and thought, man, if he can do it in his climate, we're about the same climate, so I ought to be able to do year-round gardening. And so I started being more serious with my gardening, and my wife, Leanne, you want to raise your hand? This is my wife, Leanne. She'll be here helping us in a bit. We have 11 children, and we wanted to eat fresh out of the garden as much of the year as we can. And for the last almost 2.5 years now, we have been harvesting solid out of our garden without any additional heat. And for the last couple of years, we've had 400 plus visitors to our garden to see what we're doing and how we're doing it, and would like to welcome you to come and visit our garden if you'd like to. Afterwards you can talk to us about it. I also have a website where I try to document some of the things that I'm doing if you'd like to see. It's at www.garden.uvci.com, or just plain garden.uvci.com will get you there as well. So when I first started doing my transplants real serious about 8 to 10 years ago, I was buying plastic flats and buying the inserts that go into them and planting into it, and I hated throwing all those inserts away every year. And started playing with some of the things like Caleb is doing, and trying to get really predictable results, and decided that I was going to try soil blocking, and so a year, 2 years ago, I started using soil blocks, and I've never looked back. So what I'd like to do today, and again, this is, everybody that gardens is in a different place and in a state of progress. Nobody does things exactly the same way every year, because you look and say, what did I do last year that didn't work as well, and what could I try to do next year that'll work better? And so this is the current state of where I'm at, and it could very well change next year, but this has worked very well for me, and this is probably the most stable state that I'm at right now.
Clarence, where do you live?
I live in Linden on the west side of State Street. So first off, watering is a real time consumer. And Caleb showed you his closed method for watering. And that works very well. I decided to try to adopt one that's a little bit different. And so I like to provide some bottom heat. And so I use a heat mat for bottom heat. And this way I can regulate exactly what my soil temperature is. I don't have to be quite as picky about what my water temperatures are. And I can get really predictable results. This pot of tomatoes, or this flat of tomatoes, was planted a week ago Wednesday.
Oh, wow.
And so by using a soil mat and setting the heating mat and setting it at the right temperature, you can pretty much guarantee what you're going to get. The tomatoes that I started the last week in January out in my high tunnel, and I have cheated. I've put a little bit of heat in there 2 nights. However, 2 weeks ago when it was 26 degrees, I didn't put any heat out there. And my tomatoes are almost 3 feet tall now, and blossoms and tomatoes are set. And so we'll be picking Oh, we planted them when they were about like this,
No,
you know.
we planted them that deep.
Oh, and yes, we planted them this deep into the ground. I used a little post hole digger to dig them, so they were about this tall. We pulled off the bottom leaves, planted them very deep. And they're in wallow waters, and then a hoop with floating row cover over the top, and then they're inside of a high tunnel. And they handled that 26-degree night without any problems a couple of weeks ago. But anyhow, back to starting seeds. I use a heat mat so that I can control what my soil temperatures are. for spinach and lettuce and your cool season crops, those will germinate best at 55 degrees, 55 to 60. So in your house, there isn't a problem with that. But to get good solid germination with some of your peppers, it works better if your soil temperature is up around 80 degrees to 90 degrees. And if you have a higher soil temperature, it's not that they won't germinate, but they'll germinate much quicker and much more evenly.
You said peppers and what?
Peppers and tomatoes both like warmer temperatures to grow. And so even though I have a small greenhouse, just a little 6x8 greenhouse that I start my bedding plants in, I don't like to start it till the first weekend in February, because before then it's cheaper to buy light than it is to buy heat. So I use a seed starting table in the house, and then the first weekend in February I start planting out in the greenhouse. So if you use a seed mat, if you'll put a little piece of insulation underneath it, it makes a huge difference on how much electricity it will burn to heat, because you're not having to heat the table surface underneath. And then from there, two things that I've tried is, first of all, this is just an old sign. It's political season coming up this fall. Harvest plenty of these and keep them around. They're really handy. And
Wait till after election.
right, after election. This is capillary mat. And
Right, well, some of the county stuff.
Lara, I don't know if you want to distribute that around a little bit so people can see it. I'd like to have these back at the end so that I can use them in other classes. But in Europe, this is really a popular way to water. They use it in the greenhouses instead of drip irrigation. They just lay it out across the flats. And so you put a reservoir of water at one end, you put this capillary mat in it, and the water comes up over and into it. And so I just built a little tray, and I was worried about all the excess water running out, so I put edges on it and tried to seal it up. I've since decided if you need to worry about water coming out, just go to the dollar store and get a cheap little tray like this, and it works very well. And I've used a bread pan or a little plastic tray. So you would just put water in it. Out in the greenhouse I use this, and the nice thing about this is excess water drains away. If you use a little pan like this, you have to put a measured amount of water in, because it'll carry it all over and you'll end up with water in the tray. So in the house I use this. Out in the greenhouse I use this. Question?
Where do you buy that capillary mat?
That I purchased from Gardener's Supply. I haven't seen it locally, but if you look in any of the mail-order garden places, most of them will have capillary mat. So I'm going to build up what I do here. So I've got my reservoir capillary mat that goes over the edge of it. Thank you. And then I've got a very fine ground sphagnum peat moss seed starting mix. This is the same stuff that is used at Vineyard Nursery. I just go talk to Grant and get a bag of this every year, and that's what I use for seed starting. This is a soil blocking tool, and they come in multiple sizes. This is the small size for starting seeds, and this is a larger one that makes a 2-inch block. And we'll be doing both of these here. The small one makes blocks that are between a 1/2 inch and 3/4 of an inch big, and there's 20 of them in here. And so works best if you have it a little bit wet before you start. You want to have your soil mixed up to about the consistency of peanut butter, really, really wet. And then you just pack your charge in until it looks like that, and then scrape it off. And then I measured this so that it takes 2 of these side by side, so I can start 120 plants on this little space. So I just take it and punch it in here. And if you have your soil moisture just right, these come out really well, and if you don't, they stick a little bit. And these are sticking worse than I've ever had before. It's because I'm doing a demonstration. So when you're done, you have this nice row usually of seed blocks that are pushed out here that have a little dimple in them. So then for small seeds, you know, we're all looking for easy ways to garden and take less time. I mentioned that really an avid gardener, my wife and I with our large family produce more than 50% of the food that we eat, we grow ourselves. And since we've been doing that, our health has been so much better, we almost never go to the doctor anymore. And we're doing so much better, and so we're trying to get that percentage up even higher. And we harvest fresh greens as much as we need all winter long. So this simplifies the watering. I just put a pint of water in there once a day, and it's taken care of. That's all I've got to do to start it. Well, planting seeds, especially small seeds, can be really tedious. Now, the way Caleb did it was to just dump a bunch of them in, and that works really well. Then you prick the individual plants out. And I've been there. I do a little different method now. And this is totsoi. It's an Asian green, and it's a relatively inexpensive seed, so I don't feel bad about using it for this demonstration. So I just put them out in a little. This is the top of a frosting can, but something like this, it has a little bit of an edge on it. And so I've got my seeds there, and if I just take a toothpick and get it wet, the seeds will stick to the toothpick. And so then you just go along just like so, and you're planting your seeds. And you can plant them really fast, relatively speaking, and you only get 1 or 2 seeds per flat per pocket. Then when you're done, you just take a little bit of soil and just, you know, between your fingers, just kind of cover the top, and that's all there is to it, and your seeds are often planted. So when this is laid out, I will have rows of 10 across, and so then I just take a plant label, and I brought long ones. I usually cut these in half if they're this long, and write what's on it, and then I'll just lay that between the rows of seeds coming up the side. So I plant either 5, and if there's 5 in a row and 5 something else in the other row, then I'll put a label on each side so that I know what's in that row. And the label, standard with me, I put the label behind the row so that then I can have lots of different varieties of seeds all coming here at the same time and keep track of which ones they are. So that gets us through planting. Any questions about anything so far? If you'll Google soil blocks, you'll be amazed at how many places they're available. This is about $25 to buy. Johnny's Seed, every February, runs a sale on them that's like 10 to 15% off. And so if you're holding off this year and getting ready for next year, go to Johnny's website, and everybody ought to subscribe to Johnny's newsletter, whether you buy their seed or not, and you ought to request a catalog from them. The Johnny's Seed catalog is the best catalog out there for cultural techniques for growing, seed germination temperatures, and just basic information. They have the most informational catalog that's out there. And Johnny's puts their soil blocking stuff on sale every year, and usually in February. At least they have the last 4 years. I actually ordered these from Grow Organic, Peaceful Valley. When I ordered mine, they were having a sale that particular year, but they haven't had a sale on them since then. So after we're up, and depending on what it is, if it's peppers, you're going to be 2 or 3 weeks out. Tomatoes, I was up in Seattle all week, and I was worried about these not being babysit while I was gone. Not my wife, one of my daughters had that responsibility, one of my children. So I actually started them a few days earlier. I started on Wednesday. Normally I would have started them either Friday night or Saturday and just had them a week old before I transplanted them. Yes?
You don't have them covered like Caleb's in the little greenhouse?
Nope.
You don't cover them at all?
I don't cover them at all. I put them on a heat mat, and I just put a pint of water in the reservoir once a day, about the same time of day. So with me, when I come home from work, I change my clothes, I go out and I water the greenhouse. It takes me about 15 minutes. Even hauling water from the house out to it before the irrigation water is turned on, it only takes me about 15 minutes or so to take care of it. One other thing, since we're not going to be picking our seedlings out and transplanting them the way that Caleb demonstrated, occasionally you'll get 2 seedlings growing up in the same soil block, and you really will only want to have one there. And rather than pulling the seedling out and disturbing the roots of the seedling that's there, the easiest way to take care of that is just get a little fingernail clippers and just, as you're transplanting them, decide which seedling you want to stay there and just clip the others off with a little pair of scissors. Is by far the easiest way that I've found to do my thinning. So now that I've started with this small seed block and my seedlings are up and going, I'm going to use this 2.5 inch seed block here, or 2-inch seed block. And this one I've put square inserts on them. They don't come with this. They come with a little dibble for planting seeds in, like squash seeds or cucumbers that are larger seeds, to plant those. This is an option that you can buy so that they actually have these little square blocks. So this square block now is exactly the right size for our little seedling blocks that we've made. And the soil that I use for this is a little more coarse. Oh, by the way, if you have a really cool house or you're doing this down in your basement, you can always put one of these little plastic covers over your seedlings to try to keep from losing as much heat out, keep them a more even temperature. If you're doing this in a bright window, once the seedlings come up, don't put the cover on it anymore. They can at times overheat. And if you're doing it out in a greenhouse, or if you have a sun porch or something like that, definitely take this off after the seedlings come up, or you'll cook your seedlings. So this is a soil mixture that's half this same stuff and then just half potting soil. So it needs to be a little coarser than what this is. And so again, works best if you get your blocking tool wet before you start. And again, my soil mix is really wet. It's about peanut butter consistency. And charge it up, scrape it off. And I'll go ahead and do a few of these here before I show you what I'm doing. And this bin of soil will do a flat. And as you can see, the flat is not quite the right width. If I turn the soil blocker this way, these blocks aren't quite square, and so it doesn't line up. So I just take the blocks. You can see they're fairly sturdy. Once the roots grow in them, you could play tag with them and throw them around and they won't fall apart.
Okay, they're not quite that sturdy.
My wife accuses me of
But they're really good.
exaggeration.
I mean, we just lift them out. I'm holding the cart and I'm lifting them out and passing them to him because he's got the trowel, planting them in the garden. And they're, the worst part is if there's any roots from one to the next. That's really what.
And if you don't pack them together too tight, there's actually an air space between them, and they will air prune.
Mm-hmm.
And so the roots will grow out to the edge of the block and they'll stop growing. If you pack them real tight together, then they don't. So then these are designed, let me hold this up where it's a little easier to see. These are designed so that this seedling plug just fits in to the other block, and so you're off and running.
And then there's no root disturbance at all. There's just no time that lapses. They just keep growing. And so we've found this to just...
Clarence, can you repeat what your wife is saying? We can't.
Okay, the nice advantage of this is that there's no root disturbance at all. When I take, and I'll go ahead and I find that it works best if you kind of
Slice it like a cake, a little.
especially if you don't get them done right on time. If you just wait till it's about this, the cotyledons are out, so that the roots really haven't grown out of this yet, but the roots will grow down into the capillary mat, they'll grow into the others, so if you wait a couple of weeks, then you're having to kind of slice them up just a bit. But the tomato seedling that I've got here, So there's no disturbance of the root at all. Just push it down in, and now I've transplanted it, and it's off and going, and no root disturbance. So really, really fast, we're up in business.